Hey, what's going on, everybody? Today, we'll be talking about a few current and former NBA players who didn't back down from the king himself, LeBron James. These guys chose to stand their ground, argue, and even antagonize James, even though he was one of the best players in the league at that time. They chose not to worship him, but rather to think of him as a competitor, and he was in their way. Let's get right into it. The first man that didn't back away from a fight with LeBron James was Enes Kanter. While he wasn't the first to ever get in the face of James, he was one of the more recent men. The beef between the two of them first began when LeBron made comments during an interview about who the New York Knicks selected in the NBA draft. The team opted to draft Frank Ntilikina over Dennis Smith Jr., and James mentioned that the team missed out on an opportunity to grab a diamond in the rough. Obviously, Kanter caught wind of the comments after they made big headlines, and he chose to stick up for his rookie teammate.
And you ain't coming to my house playing that water bottle flip game again. I don't care who you are, king, what do you call yourself, king, queen, princess, whatever you are.
Claiming that James' comments were disrespectful and that he was in no position to say what he said, given that he isn't even on the team in the first place. James responded to that comment with this: "He's always got something to say. I don't know what's wrong with him." It wasn't long before they got into an altercation during the middle of an NBA game face to face. James had slammed home an alley-oop while the Cleveland Cavaliers were facing the Knicks one day. The ball ended up rolling a bit before their rookie guard Ntilikina bent down to pick the ball up and start play again. But James randomly just bumped into him, and the rookie took offense to it, pushing James out of the way. But James just walked right back into him and stood there. Ntilikina finally shoved him out of the way one more time before officials got involved. But Kanter wasn't going to let him get in the face of his young teammate that's already been criticized enough by LeBron. He ran up to James and the two got inches away from one another while barking away before a big scuffle between the teams started to take place with everybody arguing and shoving. Officials eventually got in to stop the scuffle, but the damage was already done between Kanter and James. Kanter said after the game that he and his team were going to go out and improve every single day and try not to worry about guys like James interfering in their plans. As for LeBron, well, he simply said that he wasn't going to ever bring up Kanter's name again, while also just saying that they were the team that got the win in the end. Nazr Mohammed was another player that didn't back down to a potential fight with the king. Mohammed first joined the Chicago Bulls back in 2012 and was going there to be a force off the bench for the team. Nazr didn't do much throughout the year, but he did make a statement during a playoff game between the Miami Heat and the Bulls. It started with James receiving a technical foul for grabbing Mohammed during a fast break. At first it didn't seem like much, but James did indeed wrap him to the ground. Mohammed didn't just back away from LeBron though. Instead, he hopped back up and shoved James to the floor over it before getting held back by teammates. Nazr was eventually ejected for his actions and even went on to apologize after the game for what had transpired. Although he took a subtle shot, saying that he could have done a lot more damage, claiming that he blacked out a little bit and was glad that he only reacted with a simple push. James never spoke about the incident, but the video of the two on the court was all that we needed to see. Some players would have simply walked away from LeBron, but Nazr wasn't going to let that happen just yet, and he didn't really care how much of a superstar he was. Just like our next player, Fred VanVleet, the Toronto Raptors were locked in a playoff series against the Cleveland Cavaliers. LeBron started a fast break attempt, and Fred attempted to run him down. James passed the ball to an open teammate who took a shot at a three-pointer, while Fred and James ran down to the basket in order to get positioning for the rebound. It seemed like VanVleet was trying to shove him out of the way because there wasn't any possibility of him getting good enough positioning for the rebound given his size. But LeBron wasn't going to let it slide and decided to turn around and shove him after the shot went in. VanVleet actually was charging over to shove him back, but his veteran teammates weren't going to allow that to happen and restrained him from making anything worse. A few years down the line, Fred talked about his respect for LeBron as a player and a person, but also said that he doesn't want to respect him on the court. He wants to play tough and hard no matter who's out there against him, and refuses to let his emotions get in the way of the game that he's trying to play. James never commented on that in classic LeBron fashion, but it was obvious that the two each had respect for one another despite the small argument. Fred was one of the few that chose to go after LeBron instead of walking away in fear of being criticized. Speaking of people who don't have any fear of criticism, Patrick Beverley is definitely one of those guys. Beverley is actually the guy that starts fights instead of running away from them, so it's no surprise that he finds himself on this list. The hatred between the two players started in a game between the Houston Rockets and the Cleveland Cavaliers. LeBron caught a pass and started driving down what he thought was an open lane until Beverley stepped in and attempted to take a charge for his team. This sent the two players sprawling onto the ground, with James falling on top of Patrick. But Beverley wasn't done. He grabbed James' arm, and the two immediately started pushing and arguing even though they were laying on the ground. That resulted in each of them picking up technical fouls. But their story wasn't done just yet. Just this past year, when LeBron was on the Los Angeles Lakers, James drove into the lane for 2 points before a foul was called on the floor and he had to stop play for a second. Beverley was the closest defender to him at the time, and instead of stopping play, he tried to rip the basketball away from LeBron during the game, with James just pushing him out of the way in disgust. He even tried getting in his face to start a fight and try to give his squad some momentum, but LeBron simply ignored him and continued on his own way. A little while later, Beverley was approached by reporters and was asked what it was like to go head-to-head against LeBron on the court.
Can you describe the challenge it is defensively when LeBron...
No challenge.
But particularly the end of the game...
No challenge.
Beverley gave a simple response and claimed that it was easy guarding James on the floor, and that it wasn't what people make it out to be. These comments were made shortly after a game between the Clippers and the Lakers where the Clippers were up by 3 points with just about 3 seconds remaining. Beverley was matched up with James on that final possession and was able to block his three-point attempt before getting the crowd going for his team. Beverley rode that strong play long after and into the locker room. While he didn't put up nearly the stat line that James did in that game, his trash-talking ignited after the play and is a main reason that the two players are still not very fond of one another even off the court. Next up, we have a member of the Brooklyn Nets, not a current player, but rather a former member of the team. Mirza Teletovic found himself on the wrong end of a fast break, with LeBron James sprinting at him to try and get a free layup to close the gap between the Miami Heat and the Nets that game. Teletovic took one step out of the way and wrapped his arms around James as he drove, seemingly hitting him in the face. This infuriated LeBron to the point where he got himself straightened up and headed right after Mirza to get into his face and potentially start a fight with him, something that we don't get to see James do very often, if at all. It resulted in a large scuffle where a few players on either side had to step in and break up the pile to avoid any further injuries or punishments, while the coaches had to rally their bench players to avoid letting them step onto the court and involve themselves in the fight. The crowd rained down boos for both players as every official tried their best to figure things out as they were going. When the commentators were taking a deeper look at how it all started, it was obvious that Mirza could have been defending his teammate who took a LeBron James elbow to the face mere seconds before he was wrapped up. The interesting part about the whole situation is that Teletovic never backed down even a little bit, even while there was an angry LeBron charging him. Mirza actually just stood there and stared at him confused that he was angry before laughing in his face over the matter. It was like he found it funny that LeBron was so angry over a little wrap-up, and there was no way that he had any fear over a player who happened to be one of the best in the league at that time and still is today. After the officials took some time to get together and sort out all the information, they called a flagrant foul on Teletovic and allowed James to shoot a few free throws, basically scoring the points that he was going to get anyways had Mirza stepped aside and let him drive through for an easy layup. Thank you all so much for watching, and be sure to leave a like and subscribe if you enjoyed. Check out this video of LeBron James up next.